Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today with Christy Tending, nonfiction editor of Sundog Lit. Welcome, Christy. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And as always, thank you for coming, guys. Any questions that you have, go ahead and type them into the chat, and I will work them into the conversation. So Christy, why don't you tell us about the origin of Sundog Lit? Have you been with the magazine from the beginning? And so take us
I
through
yeah,
the
so
beginning of it
I
and your
I haven't been with the organization from the beginning. Um and I've only been with Sundog for a couple of years, but the thing that drew me to Sundog a couple of years ago, I was looking to get more into um the literary magazine world, not just as a writer, which I also am, but as an editor and as a reader. And the thing that drew me to Sundog was first of all the kind of editorial style, what had been published in the past. And then the thing that I think is really one of Sundog's incredible legacies is, well, it's twofold. And these were kind of criteria for me as an editor if I was going to give my time to an organization. And so Sundog, first of all, pays its writers, and second of all, is really committed to publishing new and emerging writers. We publish almost exclusively from Slush from Submittable, um, which means, I mean, in my tenure at Sundog, we haven't taken a single solicited piece. Like, we don't really solicit. So those two sort of parts of Sundog Literary's legacy and kind of commitment were really important to me as an editor. And those are two of the core reasons I chose to get involved with Sundog specifically versus like other literary magazines that were looking for editors at that time.
So how did that come about, you getting involved? Like, did you publish with them and then it became sort of an organic relationship, or did you just reach out and ask if they needed someone?
So it's so funny because I actually had a piece in their queue that I had to withdraw when I got my
Oh,
editors. But it's actually a very sad story. The sort of head nonfiction editor at Sundog passed away very suddenly, and the assistant nonfiction editor was choosing to leave Sundog for mostly unrelated, you know, life happens, we aren't getting paid, like things come up, kind of reasons. And so Sundog was basically looking to rebuild its nonfiction team like from the ground up. And so originally, and this I think is one of the things that makes our team really interesting and somewhat unique, is that when the three of us, um, and I share this with two other nonfiction editors, when the three of us were offered our positions, uh, basically there was like a call put out on social media. A bunch of people put in applications. I did a Zoom interview with Eric, who's our lead fiction editor, who is amazing, who just asked me all kinds of questions like, what do you like to read? And what's your kind of, editorial lens when you're looking at things? And essentially, like, what does literary citizenship mean to you? And three of us were brought on board as nonfiction editors, and our team was sort of given the choice, like, we would like, if we're going to do a department hierarchy where there's a head nonfiction editor and two assistant nonfiction editors, here's the person we want to lead the team, but we're going to leave the structure of this like up to you all. And what we decided instead is that we would all be called simply nonfiction editor, and that we would do our decision making process for pieces in the nonfiction section by consensus. So essentially, like, everybody has to agree on a piece, everybody has to sort of be bought in on what we're publishing. and we get to make that decision together rather than one person sort of overriding everyone else and saying like, this is what we're publishing, now get to work.
That's great.
And so that process has been, and I come from an activist background, so like making decisions by consensus is really comfortable to
Mm.
me, and I sort of naturally resist hierarchy. So again, I was like, I found the right place and I found the right people to be working with.
Like the Occupy movement of literary magazine.
I mean, like a little bit in terms of making sure that, you know, in every issue, we're sort of, it's not just one style, it's not just one demographic that's being represented. And I know there's like been so many conversations about, you know, diversity in the literary world, but it's really baked into not just like our ethos and what we believe, but like the structure of how we do the work itself.
Sure. So are there still 3 nonfiction editors now?
There are still 3 nonfiction editors. We're based all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one person, maybe even in Philly. I know they're in Pennsylvania somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm pretty sure in Philly. We've got one person in London, and then there's me. So on the West Coast. So coordinating conference calls is a little bit tricky,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, our getting us together is always, you know, a blast. We just get together and talk about writing and geek out over pieces that we loved and sort of push each other and advocate for things. And there's always a little bit of jockeying, but it's like, it's the best time.
Yeah.
What could
So
be better than talking about writing?
you mentioned your editorial lens, which I think is a great phrase. So can you tell us about your editorial lens, and also do you see that lens as the same kind of lens as the other 2 editors, or is that what sort of makes the magic work, that everybody has like a different lens and then you come together and talk about the work?
So one of the really beautiful things is that all of us come from really different backgrounds. And we have a very similar editorial lens in terms of what we're looking for, in terms of what to us makes a piece successful, and and what we see as something that's going to fit in with Sundog's kind of vibe and legacy. Again, all 3 of us have only been at this now for 2 years. So I think we're cognizant of the fact that like there are a whole bunch of years behind us, and kind of like we want to make sure that we honor the reputation that Sundog has built and sort of honor Sundog's overall sort of editorial vibe. We're not interested in coming in and kind of like changing that. Like we all chose to work for Sundog because we love Sundog. Like I'm not like I don't want to elbow my way in and be like, and now we're going to change everything and strip it all back. But I think that there are certain things that there was one piece a couple of issues ago that I can't stop thinking about because it was such an amazing conversation. Because usually the way that the conversations go is we all show up to our meetings with maybe our like 5 favorites, and we're choosing 3 pieces of nonfiction for each issue. And all 3 of us showed up, had the same number 1 pick. And the only way we could describe it is it's so Sundog in terms of like, I think it was sort of like a list structure. So it had sort of like an unusual structure to it that wasn't just simple essay form. It was sort of this borrowed form. It was a little bit braided, so it brought in a lot of different ideas to the piece. It was nonlinear. So to us, like we're always looking for something that, even if the topic is very serious, the approach to the topic is somewhat inventive or playful or unusual, or it surprises us in some way. That's sort of what floats things to the top for us when we're choosing pieces. And obviously beautiful language and obviously well crafted, but kind of surprising and maybe what other people would call weird and we would call fun.
We have a question here, just covering the basics. What parameters do you have regarding length? And I was wondering that too, because it looked like the pieces were sort of on the short side.
So we have, I believe, a 3,000 word limit. We definitely love shorter pieces that sort of pack a lot of power into a shorter length. And that being said, we've had a couple of discussions, and I actually can't even remember whether it was on the nonfiction side or whether it was a question that came from fiction at one point. But if it's like 3,050 words or 3,100 and it blows us out of the water, we're like, somebody on the masthead, if it blows them away, will fight for that.
Mm-hmm.
If it's like 3,500 or 4,000, like, that's clearly not a 3,000 word piece. So we do have that limit. I would say that in general, we do have a strong affection for shorter pieces that kind of get to the emotional gut punch a little bit sooner.
Sure. Can you tell us,
That being said, like, we've had some amazing longer pieces, and like we've been very happy to like do editorial processes on, 2,500 to 2,800 word pieces. So like, if you've got something longer, don't hold back. Like, please send it to us. But for the three of us, I think we love it when you like really get the shit in earlier.
To
Not
clarify, you
amazing
don't mean
analogy.
like, if it's something longer, you don't mean like send a 7,000 word. You just mean
I
like
do not mean 7,000 words. I have a 7-year-old and I'm about to release a book. And if you send me something that's 7,000 words, my eyes will glaze over and like,
yeah.
I don't send us something that's 7,000 words. I mean, send us something that's like closer to the 3,000 word mark. Like, don't read 3,000, but hear my preference for shorter pieces and think, oh, I can only send her something that's like 1,500. I mean, as long as you're somewhat within our parameters, don't be afraid for something longer. But that's just, and I think it's somewhat of a coincidence. And that's one of the things that's hard about only having done this for like a couple of years now, and 5 like editorial cycles, is that some of this could be coincidence that we've just gotten incredible shorter pieces. But
Sure. And so nonfiction, it's a very broad term. So can you tell us about, like, I was looking at some of the pieces were definitely personal. There's one piece that felt like a little more opinion, like political opinion skewed. So can you tell us, like, what are you looking for, reportage or more personal essays, or just anything that sort of falls into the nonfiction category?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what we publish in some cases is sort of like luck of the draw. And it almost feels like there's something in the air for each submission queue that we get in terms of things echoing each other. We had one issue, I can't remember, 2 or 3 issues ago, where I think every single piece that we published was a personal piece about parental death.
Hmm.
And I mean, we all came to the meeting and we were like, what is going on? Because it was that apparent from the submission queue. So in that case, our sort of job was to figure out, okay, and these were not the only 3 pieces that we got about front. I mean, we're talking like 10 to 20% of the submission queue.
Mm.
Like, okay. So from this, we've got to like figure out which of these pieces is gonna advance and is gonna go forward. And then in other cases, and I think, given what's been going on the last like 8 or 9 months, I think we're going to see a lot more reportage, a lot more political opinion, a lot more political work sort of braided with personal essay kind of work. And I think that's just sort of indicative of the climate that we're in right now. It's like there's a lot going on and people are going to write about it.
Mm-hmm.
And we are definitely excited when we see a lot of research brought in to essays. We had a piece, I think, maybe last issue, that had a lot of research sort of blended in, and that's always kind of interesting. First of all, because we're learning something, and second of all, it shows a level of care that, you know, they're not just writing from personal opinion or from personal experience, but sort of braiding in some of these other pieces and offering something new as a result. So I think, you know, we're very open to that. I would say, like, definitely if you are going to write something political, I would suggest going on our website and having a look at like what our particular political lens is, to see if we're a good fit for you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in general, you know, we're all excited about that. If
Yeah.
that's, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm going to end every sentence with like, if the writing is great, we're really excited about, you know, so.
Is there anything you don't want to see? Maybe that might also help winnow it down. Like, no, like I think people, because nonfiction, it sounds like you don't want like academic essays. It's not
Nothing overly academic.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just not, it's just not who we are. Like
Yeah.
there are plenty, and it's one of those things where it's like, and there are plenty of places where you can send your academic work. We just don't happen to be one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But like research that is interpreted for a wider audience, anything personal, even if it doesn't have any research in it, you know, borrowed forms, make it weird,
Mm-hmm.
bring it on. We're ready.
We have a question here. Such an interesting pair of nonfiction essays in the current issue by Nicola Quendo. As a novice nonfiction writer, how is her second piece, Meditation, classified as nonfiction rather than prose poem?
She sent it to us as nonfiction, and we believe her. And I mean, as a nonfiction writer myself, I will sometimes look at a piece, and depending on the outlet, sometimes I will send it as nonfiction, sometimes I will send it as a prose poem. And, you know, that was one piece where, and that's sort of like the borrowed form that I'm talking about, where like it could be a prose poem, but she sent it as nonfiction, and we were like excited that we got it in our queue instead of poetry getting it in their queue.
Well, yeah, I like this question too, because I myself, full confession, am a novice nonfiction. I've been sort of experimenting with personal essays a little bit.
Yeah.
I do fiction, but I'm sort of like branching out. And I'm curious, in your experience reading nonfiction submissions, are there common pitfalls that you see? Like, oh, this would have been so strong, but this is another writer who, ended in the character's head instead of in scene, or something like that, like something that you see a lot of, that you could just tell writers like your work would be so much stronger if you just, I don't know, blank.
So I think that, and I'm going to preface this by saying that this is very personal opinion, and it's not to say it can't be done well. Again, this is all under the umbrella of like, if the writing is great, then it could probably work. A couple of instances stick out for me where we were like on the fence about a piece, and it was like a little bit vague about what the emotional impact had been of the experience, and then a little bit vague or a little bit not quite as strong in the ending, almost to the point where like if you just cut like the last 3 paragraphs and left us with like the impact of it, because in nonfiction so often, like my question is like, either what is the personal impact of this, like in a personal essay, for instance, like, because 1,000 people can have the same experience and have 1,000 different like takeaways, or like what's the impact on you, including like parental death, for instance. So like, what was the impact that this left, and then sticking the landing on the piece in a way that like you either sit back and go oof, or you scroll back to the beginning to figure out like where the strings where they like were able to pull that off. It's like a braided essay that really brings all the pieces together at the end, where you're like, wait, how did they do that? You're like going back through it, like trying to figure out the like magic trick that they just pulled off. Like that's the thing that's gonna make me send it forward, versus an ending that's like a little bit vague, or a little bit, we're not totally sure what happened there.
Yeah.
And that comes directly from like 2 different pieces that I can remember pretty clearly we were like on the fence about, and it just didn't stick, those particular pieces. And that's either a result of like sort of pulling your punch at the last minute in terms of like getting personal with it, or it's a little bit like leaning too much into the academic or like the intellectualizing at the end.
Mm-hmm. Can you define a braided essay? I think it seems like a self-evident definition, but I think it might be
I would be
interesting.
so happy
Yeah,
to talk about braided essays.
yeah.
Like I'm like, I could talk about braided essays all day. So you made my day. Like, let me get comfortable.
Tell us about the braid.
So excited. Okay, so in my mind, a braided essay is an essay where you're bringing 2 seemingly, on the surface, unrelated ideas or events, and you're sort of weaving them together so that they mirror one another. And this is one of my very favorite exercises to do when I'm stuck in writing, is like just to write down a bunch of things either about me or that I like to do, or experiences that I've had. And then I try to connect them to each other in that list in interesting ways. So for instance, right now I'm working on a piece that is for a particular prompt, but it's about sort of the practice of writing and the practice of reading tarot.
Reading tarot.
And how, yeah.
Okay.
And so in this essay, which is like a braided essay, I'm talking about, craft and the ritual of sitting down to write, and, what writing means to me and the outcome and all of that. And I'm mirroring that against, the act of reading tarot and the ritual involved in that, and what it reveals about me and all of that. So that's one example that I'm like currently noodling on, but it could really be about anything. And I think that it's one of the things that makes, a personal essay, because people talk about like different categories of essay, like a lyric essay and a personal essay and a more academic essay and the researched essay and the braided essay. But the fact is, in my mind, like the really successful personal essays often are braiding in something else besides the direct experience. Mm-hmm. So again, just because this was such an obvious example in Sundog's, sort of nonfiction canon, like the parental death, it was very few of these were just like straightforward encounter of the experience of having one's parent pass away. Often it was like what that made you remember, or how your life experience affected how that landed for you, or like my mom passed away in December, and so I've been thinking a lot about sort of the intersection of that experience with my Buddhism, and how like my Buddhism has like colored that experience for me. And so that to me is like what a braided essay is. And what a braided essay can do is really illuminate both of these things. And a braided essay doesn't have to just be two braids. Like I read a Melissa Febos braided essay in either Granta or Paris Review. I can't remember. But it's called Kettle Holes, and you should look it up. But we counted the braids at one point in a workshop that I was in. I want to say it was like 9 or 10. Was This is the one where you're like going back to the beginning and you're trying to figure out like where the strings are, like where the magic trick is, because it was so incredible what she was able to pull off with all of these different braids, and you never felt like you were losing one. You never felt like you were being jerked back and forth. It was really seamless, and to the point where you're like looking for the seams.
Mm-hmm. So what's the difference between a braided essay and just like a regular essay that's about a bunch of stuff? Like, is there
Sorry, I'm just putting something in the chat. It's Melissa Febos. I believe it's also in one of her essay collections, but I can't remember which one. It might be Girlhood. But she's amazing if you want to get like real deep into braided essays, like go read Melissa Febos's memoirs. She will knock your socks off. So what's the difference between a braided essay and an essay that's just like about a bunch of different stuff? To me, a braided essay is that the braids add up to something greater than their parts. So, for instance, if you've got like 3 or 4 essays, like you could talk about each of those things separately within an essay, and often we do, like, this made me think of this, and you flash back to this other experience, or this made me think of this other thing, and you sort of go off in a different direction. A braided essay really, if it's done successfully, to me, is that with a bunch of different stuff essay, you could take one of those out and it would still pretty much be the same essay. Like you would still kind of get the point. In a braided essay, it's like every tangent has got to count for something, and you've got to understand why they're connected to each other rather than your own like logical processing around these.
Yeah.
And Hanif Abdurraqib also wrote
I'm on my second webinar, but
wrote an essay for the Paris Review called On Believing, which is another braided essay. Hey, we've got somebody who's chatting. Oh, I think you're muted now. Thank you very much. I have like an audio processing thing where like if multiple people are talking, it makes my brain hurt. So I put his name in the chat, Hanif Abdurraqib. He wrote an essay for the Paris Review called On Believing, which is another braided essay that sort of chronicles it, like, believe it or not, it's a braided essay that I want to say is only like 1,000 words, and it chronicles him driving from Ohio to a diner in Ontario, and again has all of these braids that if you took one out, it wouldn't have the same emotional resonance. And in terms of economy of storytelling, braided essay, like it's one of my very favorites, and is such an interesting illustration of his thought process and how he kind of connects all of it. Could have been an essay about a bunch of different stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But by the end, you land on this emotional resonance that you would not have gotten without every single braid along the way.
You might have just answered my next question, but I was wondering, as editor, what are some things that you see that are like they're not surprising? Because I imagine you see a lot of braided essays, and what are those moments where you're like, this is familiar, like structurally, this is unsurprising. And you just mentioned emotional resonance, and I wonder if that's part of what distinguishes like a surprising piece from a piece that's like, you know, these are interesting threads, they're interesting parts of the braid, but we've seen these kinds of revelations before.
I think so much of it has to do with how you are sort of bending language to get to that emotional resonance. So there's a line in the Abdurraqib piece in the Paris Review that I will never forget for the rest of my life. And this to me is like one of the things that makes it so successful. Is he says, if you're from a certain kind of place, you understand the difference between a place that is closed and a place that has closed. And, you know, as somebody who grew up rural, it's like you drive past a place that you've been to 1,000 times and you're like, that's not closed now, that's closed forever. And I was just like, man, that's how you say it. That's what that's like. And I think for me, like, if you can get me as a reader and especially as an editor to the point where I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what that is. Even if I've never experienced it directly, like I've never been to the diner he's talking about. I've never been to that particular part of Ontario. I haven't been to the place where he's from in Ohio. I don't have direct experience of that, but like that line I will never forget because it's so true in a way that I'd never heard articulated in that way before.
So that's really interesting. I haven't read the essay. I've never heard of this essay, but
the essay is called On Believing, and he never mentions the name of the band or the name of the song that he's talking about. You're like, you get to the end and you're like, okay, the song's been playing in my mind the entire time I've been reading this essay, and yet he's never used the band name or the song.
And is the essay about a personal relationship where the person is inaccessible to? Because I'm wondering, like, this idea of something being closed, like is closed or has closed, is that
no, it's about
like,
a geographic location.
Okay.
But there's also like how that affects him on a personal level and what it's like to experience that with other people. It's
okay.
You got to go read the essay.
Yeah,
I'm begging you. Like, I read it for the first time last summer in a workshop with Melissa Falavino, and just, I mean, I've read it like 100 times since because I'm still trying to figure out how he pulled it off.
Right.
I can't figure it out. But this is what keeps me going. This like what keeps me up at night. I'm like, how to do it.
So we have a question here. Can you talk about titles? So the person says they're trying to make their own titles more enticing. Where's the balance between pulling the reader into the writing and not giving away the point of the essay?
As a person who either can never figure out the right title or knows the title before I start writing the piece, to me, like as a writer, I understand that struggle. As an editor, I don't feel super strongly about it. Like I'm reading the whole queue anyway. I'm not like more likely to read your piece if you have an amazing title. If you have an amazing title, I'm like, well, that's clever. But then the writing also has to be Like you could send me like Untitled number 645 and I'd be like, all right, let's give it a shot. I'm reading the whole queue anyway. So and honestly, if you're having a hard time with your title, just like say, I don't know what to title this. Like
Help.
and some editors might not go for that, but like writing is hard, okay? Like if you want to send me something, send me something. I'm not going to get caught up in like, to me the title is like the cosmetic part, is like a cosmetic thing. Unless your title's incredible, in which case the title's very important. But otherwise, like don't sweat it. Send me your piece. I don't care.
So do you, when you're reading submissions, it sounds like all nonfiction submissions go directly to you and the other two editors?
So we're all reading every submission and then we're voting in submittable, and then we kind of each show up with our favorites, and we'll all, even if it's like a hands down unanimous favorite, we'll all have the submission open at the same time and look through it, just make sure that nobody's missed anything, that like we're clear on any editorial work that needs to happen, that we're all on the same page, so that we can go through it as like with as fine a tooth comb as possible, so that the work, even if we know for sure we're going to publish it, that the work when it ends up on the site is like the best it can be.
At what point in your reading will you put down a piece?
Great question. I try to read all the way to the end of each piece, even if I'm sort of skimming at certain points to be like, where is this going? In my personal reading, I might have like already set down the essay and closed the tab and been like, okay, I got it. Like, I get the point. But I want to make sure that, if there is that sort of like slam dunk ending, even if it sort of drags a little bit in the middle, like that's fixable to me. And we might be able to find ways to kind of tighten that up. But I try to read all the way through to each one. That being said, if I come across something where, even if it's not intentional, and I want to be super clear that I'm like not ascribing malicious intent to any writers when I say this, but for me, if I come across something where I'm like, ugh, where I sort of wince and go, ouch, it's insensitive, it's, leaning on a stereotype, it's in some way, if not like harmful, then just not innovative in the way it's describing people who have been historically marginalized. There was a great essay recently, maybe it's in Lit Hub, about how we write fat bodies that was excellent, and I think is like a must read for writers in terms of how we write about bodies that are like still, not just historically, but like in present day, marginalized and sort of treated in a way that's less than human. If I come across something like that in writing, that's what's going to make me stop and go, you know what, this isn't Sundog. Because if I say ouch, then like there are readers out there who are going to maybe say like double ouch, like that could actually harm our readers, in which case, like, again, even if it's not the intent, I'm just not going to put people in that position.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how many submissions you get per reading period?
I would say we probably get somewhere in the like 150 to 200 range, and we choose 3. And some of those are, withdrawn or whatever before, or they like don't meet our submission guidelines. Like there's always a handful where you're like, okay, that's just like automatically not, it's not in our running. But I would say that's it's like about 150, and we choose 3.
And your reading period, I know this info is on the website, but I'm just curious how many submissions come in when is the reading period?
I believe the submission period is March through May and September through November, maybe.
Okay.
I'm having a real like beginning of summer, like my brain is soup. Like, please go look at the website and don't listen to
It's
me.
no problem at all. I was
Like,
just curious,
please.
like how many come in like how long is the window? But I got it. It's like 3 months.
Yeah. And we
here.
have,
Yeah.
in addition to paying writers, we also have free submissions at the beginning of each reading period. So if that is a concern, you should go onto the website and make note of when those reading periods are, because at the beginning of each reading window, we have free submissions. And that's like for everybody, not just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like you do editorial work with the writers.
Yeah. And there's always, a conversation about how that's going to happen. The other two writers on the nonfiction team, one is Asian American and one is from Singapore. So we had a situation, again, my memory is so terrible right now for things like this. It was either last issue or the issue before, but it was a piece about a family's experience in a Japanese internment camp, and it needed some editorial love. And I was like, I don't think I'm the right person to edit this piece. That seems weird and not quite right to me. And so someone else took that on. So if there's like a marginalized identity or something like that, where your piece might need some editorial love, we're always really careful about like who's the best. And this is one of the great things about working on a team is, we can think about who's the best person to edit your work, and who has sort of the experience to be, to give it the care and the respect that it deserves.
And we have a comment here. I've gotten several amazing writing, skillful, beautiful, intelligent, made the final round, but rejections. It sounds like this person has gotten close call rejections. So I'm wondering, do you have any advice for writers who are getting these rejections? Should they keep trying the magazine? Do you have a policy like wait 6 months if you're rejected before trying again? Or do you encourage people to just keep trying, keep submitting?
I encourage people to submit once per reading period. I don't know if we have a rule about that or not, but I think once per reading period is about the right amount, and then you can try again when we open again. Okay, so the thing I'll say about this, first, as a writer, I have also gotten many of these. You are not alone. We all get the like. My initial response to this is like, yeah, same. And several times I've gotten those and then gotten accepted to the magazine in a different issue or a different reading period or whatever. The second thing I want to say is, and I know this is hard to hear because it's one of those things that you can't do anything about. I just want to emphasize just how much of this is actually about luck, and like when you're landing in someone's inbox and like who else you happen to be in the submittable queue with at any given time. There are studies that talk about like editors at publishing houses are more likely to reject a book if they're hungry, if they need to use the bathroom, if they're reading the book at the end of the day instead of at the beginning of the day. I mean, human psychology is so complex that it's hard to pin down why you might be getting that. The thing I just want to say is that so much of this is luck. I mean, again, take like the instance where we had a whole issue stacked with pieces about parental death. Okay. We could have gotten something for the next issue written by Melissa Phoebos, but if it had been about a dead parent, like we're just not taking that, because like we did that last issue and all of us are very tired about like reading about dead parents. Like it just at a certain point you like reach emotional saturation with some of these topics and you're like, I can't do this anymore. So like that would have been a thing that would have gotten me to stop reading, is like if our last issue was like full of that and then I got another one of those pieces, I would have been like, yo, I'm so tired. I can't, which is one of the reasons why, and again, I'm so sorry. Read the magazine before you submit, because if it's exactly like something we just published, like it kind of doesn't matter how good it is because we just did that. And like, remember, we want things that are weird and surprising. And if it's just like something we just published, it's not going to be that surprising. We're like, yeah, we know that experience is horrible. We all know. But I think the like amazing writing, skillful, beautiful, intelligent made the final round. Like, first of all, yeah, you're not getting published, so it isn't like an acceptance, but it should be really affirming of your writing, because we don't write those things for no reason. In submittable, you actually have to do extra work to do things like that. And so we're not just sending those to everybody. It's not just like to pump up people's egos. We actually believe in you and your work. It's just sometimes luck of the draw. And I just can't emphasize like how much of this comes down to timing and luck and all of that. It's not fair, and it sucks, and it's not comforting, and I'm sorry. But just so you know, I'm also telling all of these things to myself when I get my like 8, ooh, so close from the same place.
So we've talked about nonfiction primarily, which is super interesting, but for the fiction and the poetry, would you say the aesthetic is the same as what you've described, like inventive, playful, surprising to the, whatever editor is reading it? Is that across the board for the other genres?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. Like, be bold. Send us your stuff where you're like, this was weird. What am I doing? Like, it shouldn't be so experimental that you haven't proofread it, probably. But if you're wondering like who might want to take a chance on a particular piece, that would be a great choice for us.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Like, because I'm guessing some writers here be bold and take a chance, and they lean too hard into sensationalism or things that are excessively graphic, or I mean, I think all lit mags say no violence, all this stuff, but like, is there any,
Yeah,
can you talk a little bit about the boundary? Like, don't be bold, but don't be like disgusting or something like that.
Yeah, and the fact is, like, there are plenty of places. And this is why I don't feel guilty about setting boundaries around editorially what we're interested in, because the fact is, there actually are plenty of places that are going to take your super gross, nasty stuff. We just don't happen to be one of them. So I'll give you, and once again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, and probably sorry to repeat like what you've heard from every other editor, but like, reading the magazine will get you such a good sense. It'll get you so much closer to what we're looking for, because there are certain magazines that I read just because I love them, and they have like an absolutely microscopic acceptance rate, and I don't have super high hopes of getting in there. I will send them things until I'm done breathing or they're done existing. But like, I'm not like hanging my literary future on like getting into some of these places, but I love them. And I come to know, like, I had a piece published a couple of days ago, actually, with a place that I've been trying to get into. I looked back in submittable because I wanted to be sure, for 2 years. Okay. This was my 16th submission to them. Okay. And sometimes I just sent them stuff where I was like, even I knew, I was like, oh, this is too normy for them. Like, it was like really wholesome and sincere. And not that we don't love wholesome and sincere, but like, also make it weird. And so I sent this place a really strange nonfiction micro recently about a tomato that had achieved both consciousness and Buddhist enlightenment. And it was written from the perspective of the tomato. Okay, anyone else in the entire world is submitting this as fiction. I was like, this is nonfiction. And this is why I say, like, if you send us something in a nonfiction queue, we're gonna be like, we believe you. 100% that happened. So I sent this to them as nonfiction, and they publish it because this is the kind of place that's going to publish a piece about a tomato that has gained consciousness and Buddhist enlightenment, and this is nonfiction. And it was like, okay, now I understand now I fully have intellectualized what your vibe is.
Right.
And so if you have a piece where you're like, that is very strange, that, like, are we sure this premise even works? Like, give it a shot. And this is really what I've learned is, like, even your, like, again, make sure you're sticking the ending. Because if you have to, like, go back and explain, like, there's never any explanation, by the way, of like how the tomato gained consciousness or Buddhist enlightenment. It's just like, that's the premise of the whole thing. That's like the shared, like, consensual reality that we're like all operating from the jump. So you don't have to explain your weird, but like, can you read the piece on the tomato? Let me see if I can find it really quick while I'm also doing this.
I can also link to it in the
yeah, that's fine. But there's part of me that's like, oh, I would have also submitted that to Sundog. Like back in the day. And that's really what made me want to get involved in Sundog, is that when I was looking for places that were looking for editors, I looked at a bunch of different places and I just read full issues. And, you asked me earlier, what makes you stop reading? Could be a lot of things, but the fact is, the pieces that were published in Sundog, even before I was there, I couldn't stop reading. Mm. They felt really resonant and like something I wanted to be a part of. Mm-hmm. And so that's maybe another piece of advice is, like, if you are doing your homework of like, read the mag to find out what we like, and your eyes are rolling back in your head, or you're like not quite interested in like finishing the piece, then like maybe that's not the right home for your work. And that's amazing information to have, because submission fees are expensive and we're all very tired. And so maybe you can cross that one off your list. And I've totally done that. Mm-hmm. Like, you're not hurting anybody's feelings by not submitting to them. It's fine. You don't have to submit everywhere. It's okay. I promise.
Question here: do you think all writers ought to be magazine readers or editors at some point?
Readers, yes. Editors, maybe not. The reason I say this is, like, editing takes, being a reader is great, and I've done both. So being a reader is great because all you have to do really is like read a bunch of pieces, vote up or down, and maybe leave some comments. Okay, it's pretty low lift. You can do it a couple hours a week. I was doing it. I have a young kid, so it's not like I don't have stuff going on. But I would sit in bed at night and I would just read for an hour and, give my votes and all of that. Being an editor is sort of the next level of commitment, because I think if you're doing it right, you are participating in the legacy of a magazine that deserves respect, that's like commensurate with its legacy. And I think we've seen a lot of literary magazines closing in the last couple of years. And in part, that's like just what happens because nothing lasts forever. And part of it is, I think, has to do with people taking on editorships or remaining in editorships and not being realistic with what their capacity actually is. And that's really sad. Because if they just said, hey, we need a new fiction editor, or we need a new editor-in-chief, or we need somebody to step up and like do more reading and poetry, like maybe that magazine would have survived. Maybe not, because again, nothing lasts forever and it's all, you know, very ephemeral, and you know, this stuff won't outlive us mostly. And now we've wandered into my Buddhism, but like, but I think, you know, if you're going to take on an editorship, I think you should do it with the idea of doing it for at least 5 years. And you should do it with the intention of carrying on this magazine's legacy and and being accountable to it. You know, one of my favorite things to ask myself in my work, both as an activist as well as in literary spaces, like, who am I accountable to? And in part, you know, a big part of who I'm accountable to is like the Sundog community, the people who did all this work before I got here, and, you know, the readers and the writers who have trusted us for so many years. And I don't want to let them down. And so it doesn't make you a bad person if you don't want to be an editor, but I think you should be realistic with what you can actually offer. And I think like 2 years is kind of the minimum. I still a little bit feel like a newbie on staff. And so I think like 2 to 5 years is like a good chunk of time to commit yourself to something like this. And that's not for everybody. And maybe that's not even like in this season of your life, maybe it's not ever, but I think everybody should be a reader. Because it also gives you a sense of like what goes into all of this, and it makes you appreciate things, I think, a little bit more as a writer, is like all of the reading, all of the work that goes into making something like this go.
We have a question here. What is your realistic response time? Like,
what is our
realistic response time?
For us right now, it's probably 3 to 6 months, and I wish it were shorter. And also the thing to remember is that for places where it's not like a rolling publication schedule where they're like self-contained issues, we often don't start reading until the submission window closes. So just something to bear in mind, like if you have a piece you really want to get out in the world like as fast as possible, we might not be the place for you. If this is like, if we're really the place you want to publish, then like, you know, submit to us and we will be with you as soon as we can. I promise. We're all working really hard at this, but also like, I want to reiterate, none of us is getting paid. We all have like a bunch of other stuff going on. And so we love Sundog, but we're not, you know, we're not Smoke Long. We're not Pithead Chapel. We will not be getting back to you in 10 days. We love you. Be well.
Too much of your time, but there is a question here. It's kind of a big question, but how do the ages of editorial staff have an impact on decisions? That's something we talk a lot about at Lit Mag News, is sort of like Lit Mags tend to skew young in terms of what they publish, and is that something that is a consideration for your editors?
I get this question a lot because Sundog has a reputation for publishing new writers. We've actually published a bunch of people's first pieces. I think not since I've been on staff in nonfiction, but I know that fiction and poetry have like published the very first pieces of people who went on to do amazing things. So I actually don't know exactly how old my co-editors are. I'm in my 40s. I think my co-editors might be in their 30s. We are looking for, I can't stress this enough. We are looking for diverse experiences. So like if you are, I always see these calls on Twitter of like, where should my college students submit? Where should I teach a writing class for, retired folks in their like 70s and 80s. Where should they submit? I'm always like Sundog, because those like on those two ends of the age spectrum, we're not seeing, I think, as much as we should, especially in the nonfiction space. In poetry and fiction, I think those can skew younger. But I think in nonfiction, we tend to see, folks in sort of like late 20s to early 50s. Like that's from context clues. That's what I'm getting a lot of in our submittable queue. So if you want to write us like an unbelievable piece for our nonfiction section on menopause, like please, like write about those experiences that like don't get a ton of play. I think college has been really done in the like fiction and poetry space. But especially right now, if you're a college student and you want to send me a nonfiction piece about what it's like to be on a college campus right now, I would love you forever. Like, true, like, because those pieces those experiences get reportage from the outside, but like rarely are we hearing from people on the ground at the volume that we should. And so if you want to write into those experiences, like I am begging you, because if we're looking to diversify what we've got in an issue, like on the nonfiction side, an experience that we aren't seeing elsewhere in the submittable queue is going to be really exciting to us.
That's great. So 2 more questions. If anybody's hearing this and wants to get involved with the magazine, are there opportunities to read for the journal?
I don't know that we're taking on readers right now, but my suggestion would be to follow the places you love to read, and maybe reach out to the places where you've already published and see if they're looking for readers. We are not taking on readers right now. We are sort of like at capacity staff wise, but I always see those calls on Twitter, and I think that I would just like so encourage you to reach out to places that you already like to read, because their submittable queue or whatever submission system they use is going to be exciting to you, and you'll learn a lot. And you'll meet cool people, and you'll get to read and talk about writing, which is literally the best thing.
So one final question, which you may have just answered, but this is a question I ask all editors. We know you're busy, you're raising a little one, you've got a lot going on. So what keeps you from getting burned out? What keeps you excited? What keeps you passionate about editing a literary magazine?
I mean, what keeps me motivated editing a literary magazine is 2 things. First of all, I got the absolute luckiest with my co-editors, and when we get on a Zoom call together, it's like we get on like a house on fire. We're like we're so excited to like really hash out the work. And then I think there's a lot in terms of like what keeps me motivated overall, keeps me from getting burned out. It's like there are a lot of jokes out there about like hanging out with your cat is writing and going for a walk is writing. No, like all of those things, especially if you're a nonfiction writer, all of that is writing, because you're always like gathering that stuff so that then you can go and write about it. And so for me, it's like I need to go and live a life before I can write, always. Like that's a crucial part of my writing. And also just like following my curiosity. Like, again, what would it be like if you were a sentient Buddhist tomato? I don't know. Let's find out. Like, So like following my weird like questions is also like what helps
It's a great
not
life
be burned out.
lesson too. Follow
Yeah,
your
exactly. Like go out. First of all, go outside. Second of all, follow your weird. And like third of all, talk to other editors and writers because there is nothing better.
Mhm.
I like, you know, I'm not getting paid for my work on Sundog, and like I love it. It's like every time I get off a call with those other people, I'm always like, I am so inspired right now. They're so brilliant. They're
Yeah,
so fun to talk to. This is the best.
that's awesome.
All of life should be like getting to walk around outside and talk about books.
Agree,
Okay,
agree.
that's
Well, thank
that's
you.
my like parting wisdom.
Thank you so much, Christy. This was
Thank you
great.
so much for having me. This was like the most fun. This is the best. This is the best.
Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thanks for coming. Y'all have